Okay. Boker Tov, everybody. A pleasure to have you on behalf of Torah Motion. And we're looking forward to a wonderful day of learning. And I want to thank everybody. Next week, of course, we'll have another one of our Yemei Iyun on Sukkot. So we go from Yom Kippur to Sukkot. Lots of stuff going on. So Baruch Hashem. And we'll kick off with Dr. Malka Simkovich, who is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society and visiting professor at Yeshiva University Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. All her wonderful other accomplishments you can look on the website. Her shiur is being sponsored by Doreen and Morris Sosnowitz in honor of the Yortzeit of Morris's grandfather, I think Bo Bayom today. Rav Shlomo David ben Rav Yisrael Meir, who passed away in 1932 as buried in Lodz. We went together with the Sosnowitzes a few years ago on our Poland trip so he could see the kever of his grandmother and whatever. Okay, 1932, I guess, is a better time than 1942. And I think it's very interesting. He told me that the Metzeva in the cemetery says, Nasa v'nata be'emunah. He conducted his business faithfully, which of course is the first question the Talmud said God will ask us when we come to heaven at 120, and it's a very appropriate theme for Yom Kippur, of course. Okay, with that, Dr. Malka, sacred conversations sacred conversation, dialogues with God in early Jewish tradition. Vakasha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jay. I really appreciate that introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking the time from this busy Sunday as you're preparing for your Seuda, your Erev Yom Kippur Seuda, and the other Shabbatot and Sukkot. I appreciate all of you making the time to come. One of the things that Jews involved in interreligious dialogue like to say is that it's easier for Jews to speak with non-Jews, with people outside of the faith, than to speak with Jews in other denominations. And over the past year, I've begun to think more seriously about why that is. I'm working on a book on dialogue in early Jewish tradition. And I've thought a lot about why it's hard for Jews to speak to one another across denominational divides. There are a few reasons for this. None of them will surprise you. The stakes are higher, I think, when we're speaking to people within the Jewish community. The boundaries are blurrier. The stakes are high when questions regarding who can represent the Jewish people to the public come up. But there's another reason why I think it's challenging for Jews to engage in intra-Jewish dialogue. There's actually, I think, very little in our tradition before the rabbinic era that tells us how Jews might speak to one another. There isn't so much sustained dialogue between Jews and other Jews in the Second Temple corpus of literature that we have that survives. There isn't so much sustained back and forth dialogue among Israelites that doesn't end up in some kind of catastrophic conflict. And there isn't so much sustained dialogue among members of the Abrahamic family, in fact. But what our traditions are absolutely concerned with is how biblical heroes speak with God, how our patriarchs and our matriarchs speak and cultivate a relationship through this speech with God, and of course, how God speaks with these figures. And in fact, Sefer Bereshit, and I think the beginning of Shemot as well, can be read as a long discourse on how members of Abraham's family and Sarah's family learn how to speak with God and cultivate a relationship with God through these dialogues. I'm going to suggest that biblical traditions about speaking with God offer a paradigm for how we might speak with one another. The search for closeness while maintaining boundaries, of course, boundaries that cannot be crossed. This tension is at the heart of the dynamic between our forefathers and foremothers and God. And it's also at the heart, I think, of a dynamic that we create when we talk amongst ourselves within Jewish tradition. Now, when we talk about communication with God in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, many of us think about prophecy or we think about prayer. But actually, neither prophecy nor prayer is really dialogical. Prophecy is when God speaks to humanity, and prayer is when humanity speaks to God. So when I think about sustained dialogue, sustained back and forth between an individual and God, in biblical tradition, I am not going to turn to prophecy and prayer because those are two sides of a coin. What I'm really looking for is, again, sustained back and forth between God and an individual, and there aren't so many examples to look for. There aren't so many examples of this, and there aren't so many individuals in the Torah who have this kind of sustained dialogue with God. There are prophets, of course, and there are people who pray. But I think that the two individuals who really have a level of intimacy with God that enables them to return repeatedly to God and to appeal on behalf of another group is Abraham and Moshe. Abraham and Moshe famously both argue with God. They advocate for a third party. They have different dynamics. They have different relationships with God. Abraham is mostly silent when God speaks with him, with two very significant exceptions. And those exceptions are Bereshit Tedvav, the covenant of the parts, when God promises Avram a nation made up of land and a family, and Avram asks for a sign, and very famously, the dialogue that takes place before the destruction of Sodom in Bereshit Yud Chet in Genesis 18. Besides that, Avram is essentially a quiet figure who almost never responds to God, unless he says, "Here I am, I'm at your service," which we know from Bereshit Chafbet, from the story of the near sacrifice of Yitzchak. Moshe also seems to be quiet by nature, but from the very beginning of being called by God, he is an immediate advocate for the people of Israel when God appears to him in Shemot chapters 3 and 4, Gimel and Daled. And Moshe, because he starts off on I would say on a more dialogical plane with God, because Moshe right away engages in a very, very long conversation with God, in which Moshe pushes back in 4 different ways and offers 4 different arguments for why he cannot lead the people. That kind of immediate closeness and intimacy allows Moshe later on in his life to request a kind of intimacy with God that no other human being in biblical tradition asks for. He asks to see God's face. As you might guess, the earliest interpreters of the Torah were highly uncomfortable with these stories. They were uncomfortable with these dialogues between God and Abraham and between God and Moshe. And they're uncomfortable, I think, for 2 reasons. We're going to look at some of these sources. And by the way, I'm going to share a very long source sheet, and you can feel free to email me and I'll send you the source sheet after the talk, or I'll send them to Jay and you can get them from the organizers of this talk. Second Temple era interpreters do not know what to do with these stories for 2 reasons. First of all, it seems it seems very difficult to think about God as seeking out these figures to have a personal relationship with them. The intimacy with which God is speaking to these people is confusing. God is standing before Abraham in Bereshit Yud Chet, and then God departs at the end of that dialogue and almost walks away in a very physical description. God stands and God departs. These are very difficult anthropomorphic descriptions of God. But another reason why these dialogues are difficult is because these figures seem to reject God's decisions and argue with them as if God can change. Now, especially in the Hellenistic era, when the philosophical notion that God is immutable, unchangeable, and transcends time and space was a non-negotiable perception of the divine, the notion that one could change God with prayer was considered to be a real difficulty when reading and interpreting the Bible. So these Second Temple interpreters ignore these stories, or they change them, they alter them very significantly, or they smooth them over in various ways by implying that where you, the ignorant reader, might see a tension between God and these figures, in fact, there is no tension at all. And what I'm going to show in the next few minutes in my very limited time is that while Second Temple interpreters are highly uncomfortable with these stories, the rabbis are not. And they restore the dialogues back into these traditions and also maintain the tension that lies at the heart of these conversations. The rabbis understood that a deep, intimate relationship with God requires honesty and the ability to challenge God, to challenge the present reality, of course, to challenge with a sense of love and commitment to a relationship. Let's dive in. We'll do what we can. Again, I'm going to share a 23-page source sheet. It could have been longer, but I had mercy on participants here, but we're not going to do all of these sources. Again, as I always say, this is like a tasting menu. We'll do a little bit from each section. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on one second. And I'm not going to look at the chat yet. So I'm sorry for that in advance. Okay, why can I not? Hold on one second. We're gonna get there. Share. Okay. Alrighty, so now you should see my screen now. Thank you, Jay, for nodding. I see your nods. That's assuring. Okay. One thing that you'll notice when you make a list of every time Abraham and God have a conversation is that there is a relationship between the content of the conversation and the modality of God's appearance. When God first speaks to Abraham, there is no introduction, there is no preparation, there is no gentle mar'eh, a vision, or a machazeh. There is simply speech, right? We have no idea what's happening in Abraham's life when God suddenly bursts into the scene. Vayomer Adonai el Avram lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladatecha u'mibeit avicha ela eretz asher eka. I had to read the whole verse because I said God's name, but there's no introduction, right? God speaks. And I want to suggest that Avram simply has no idea whether he has permission to respond. He doesn't respond, of course, very famously, he just goes. In the ancient Near East, gods were considered very powerful, mercurial, dangerous. You had to appease the god. You had to make sure that the god didn't get angry at you. You had to feed the god. And so this was probably a very frightening experience. And Avram simply doesn't know if he has permission to respond to God. But what we find out very soon is that God desires that conversation. God desires not only obedience, but a dialogical relationship. And so God, it seems, is trying to get Abraham to answer him. We have other instances in which God reaches out to Abraham, and over the course of the next 10 chapters, 10 prakim, we find that God appears increasingly more gently, rather than just bursting into the scene with speech. Later on in Avram's life, we have appearances. Vayera Hashem el Avram. God appears to Avram, and in the second instance in which God speaks, Avram again does not respond, but he does call out in the name of God. So he builds an altar, he calls out, but this isn't a direct response to God. But over time, it does happen. And it happens in Bereshit Tedvav, in Genesis 15, when God appears in a vision. Finally, God appears in a more gentle way in a vision, and now Avram works up his strength to respond to God. And when God appears in this vision, in this machazeh, and promises Avram a nation through land and children, Avram says, I need a sign. I don't know, I'm old. I don't know that this is going to happen. I don't feel that I have a guarantee. How are you going to prove to me that this is going to happen? So the first time really that Avram speaks to God, it's a challenge. But from this point on, there seems to be a much more intimate, close relationship with God. Until Bereshit Chaf Bet. Well, actually, I really shouldn't skip this most sustained dialogue that God and Avraham have, and this is the argument that Avraham makes to God to spare the people of Sodom. Here we have it's actually quite a complex coming and going. We have the three people, the three messengers, and according to tradition, the three angels representing the three various missions that Avram needs to know about. And then at some point, God himself appears. And when God appears, we're told God goes down to Avram and tells him what he is going to do. And Avram argues with God and pleads on the people's behalf. It seems from a description, from numerous descriptions in this chapter, that Avram is very, very afraid. and he's afraid of what's going to happen to him if he pushes back, but he can't hold himself back because his moral sense of moral responsibility is so strong. And so we had this language of tentative approaching, of fear. Vayigash Avram draws near, and Avram says, please consider my appeal. Vayomer al na yichar ladoni v'adabera. Please don't be angry. I'm going to keep pushing. Al na yichar ladoni v'adabra achapam. Maybe there is 40, maybe there's 30, maybe there's 20, and so on. Maybe there's just 10 righteous people. But Avram is afraid. Avram is afraid of what's going to happen to him if he continues to argue with God. Now, this is, of course, the greatness of Avram as well, that despite his fear, despite his not knowing whether God will consume him in a fiery rage, right? Despite not understanding the true nature of God, Abraham is willing to risk his life and appeal on behalf of the evil people of Sodom. And of course, this all comes to a head in Bereshit Chaf Bet, when finally, after learning how to have this conversation with God and how to dialogue with God, God appears immediately without a machazeh, without a mar'eh, without a third-party angel, just God, right? Going back to that modality of speech from Bereshit Yud Bet, God appears again. God speaks out of the blue, and he says, bring your son as a sacrifice. So after that long process of learning how to cultivate a relationship with God in a way that will be based on, it'll be based on trust and closeness and intimacy, God asks Abraham for the hardest thing, the sacrifice of his child. Now, I have to speed up because I really want to get to the Second Temple sources, but I just want to say a few things about Moshe. Moshe advocates, like I said, for the people of Israel throughout his life. He does not hesitate to argue with God, to challenge God's decisions in a way that is parallel with Abraham. He argues for God to the point where he'll say, erase me from your book, if that is what it takes to remove the culpability of the people and to forgive them. Like Abraham, Moshe is willing to risk his own bodily self in order to serve the higher relationship, which is the covenantal relationship between God and the people. And part of this might be because the beginning of the very first encounter between God and Moshe is one that's much more gentle than the one in Bereshit Yud Bet. Whereas in Bereshit Yud Bet, God appears out of the blue with speech that must have been very terrifying to Abraham. Here we have this gentle image, this image of the bush that is burning, that invites Moshe to approach and to consider and to think about what's happening. It's not divine speech bursting into his reality, but it's a mar'eh. It's a mar'eh gadol. It's a mar'eh gadol, but it is not as terrifying as divine speech. And then there's the gentleness of being called Moshe, Moshe, and God saying Hineni. And so it's a much more gentle invitation for a relationship. And therefore we go right away into this very sustained dialogue, this longest back and forth with God, I think, that we have in the Torah. Following that, there are numerous instances in which the level of intimacy between Moshe and God is quite shocking. We all know the story of Bereshit Lamed Bet Lamed Daled, where Moshe appeals to God on behalf of the people to be forgiven for the golden calf. But one story that I'd love to show, which is less known, is the story of Bamidbar Yud Aleph. This is a story after one of the numerous complaints that the Israelites have in the desert, where they're totally dissatisfied and they're complaining. They want to go back to Egypt. Moshe loses his patience and he says to God, I did not give birth to these people. You have given birth to these people, right? These toddlers are not mine to carry. Implying that God is the mother of the people. This level, again, of closeness, of intimacy, and also of argumentation really is not paralleled. All right, so all of that, we're going to set it aside, and I want to look at some Second Temple sources. As I said earlier, Second Temple interpreters were profoundly uncomfortable with these dialogues that Avram has with God and that Moshe has with God. And I'm going to start out with the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, whose years are between 20 BCE and 50 CE. Philo does not erase these stories, but he writes many treatises that interpret the Torah. And one of the themes that wends their way through his treatises, through his interpretations, is the notion that God is not changeable. And so when there is prayer in the Torah, that prayer speaks to the piety and the righteousness of a biblical hero, but not necessarily the changeability of God. And so these discourses are evidence of Avram and Moshe's closeness to God, but really not of anything that they can actually accomplish, because God cannot change. So in his treatise on the Kruvim, Philo says, a proof of Avram's familiarity with God is contained in the expression that he came near to God and spoke. That comes from Bereshit Yudchet, Vayigash Avraham. I read that as a reflection of Avram's fear that something would happen to him if he argued with God. But Philo says, it is fitting for one who has no connection with another to stand at a distance and to be separate from him. But he who is connected with him should stand near to him. And to stand and to have an unchangeable mind comes very near to the power of God, since the divinity is unchangeable. So this prayer actually has nothing to do with changing God, but it's an expression of closeness with God. And Philo says something very similar when he talks about Moshe and the discourse in Shemot Gimel and Daled. He that seemed to be feeble of speech and slow of tongue and wordless is found to be so loquacious that in one place he is represented as not only speaking but shouting, and in another as pouring forth a stream of words without cessation of pause. So this prayer is about the hero's desire to be close with God, but not about God being impacted by the speech itself. But the man of worth has such courage of speak that he is bold not only to speak and cry aloud, but actually to make an outcry of reproach wrung from him by real conviction and expressing true emotion. And Moshe reached his limit, I will not say of daring in general, but of good daring, because all the wise are friends of God. And so Moshe, more than anyone, is considered by Philo to be a friend of God. But again, this dialogue really has nothing to do with the broader divine plan. I want to skip a little bit. Well, actually, here I'll also say in his treatise on Moshe's life, Philo clarifies that the argument of Moshe has nothing to do with his emunah. Moshe did believe, but he tried to refuse the mission, declaring that he was not eloquent, but feeble of voice and slow of tongue. So these arguments have nothing to do with impiety, but they have to do with a desire for closeness and humility. Now, Philo is actually an outlier when it comes to Second Temple interpreters. Most Second Temple interpreters from the Hellenistic era, that is from the 2nd century BCE through the 1st century CE, adjust the story much more radically, and I would say even shockingly. Josephus, the late 1st century historian, makes many changes and minimizes these stories because he simply cannot tolerate the notion that Avram or Moshe argued with God to the level that they seem to in the Tanakh. And so in Josephus's retelling, for example, of Bereshit Tetvav, Abraham does not ask God for a sign. So we know from Bereshit Tetvav that God says, Al tira Abraham, do not fear, now I'm blanking, S'charcha harbe me'od, hold on, I'm going to pull it up. Anochi magen lecha, S'charcha harbe me'od, and then right away he says, Hashem Elokim, atitein li, v'anochi olei hariri, you have to give me a sign. And Josephus says, that Avram does challenge God, but does not ask for a sign. So Avram asks What pleasure can those rewards afford when there is none to succeed them after me? Similarly, in his retelling of Bereshit Yud Chet, Avram's appeal on behalf of the people of Sodom, we have a very, very condensed version of the back and forth that we have in the Torah. We have Josephus telling us that Avram was grieved for the men of Sodom, and he arose and made supplication to God, imploring him not to destroy the just and good along with the wicked. So all that back and forth that we have in Bereshit Yud Chet is condensed literally into one sentence in Josephus. To this God answered that not one of the Sodomites was good, for were there but 10 such, he would remit to all. This is a really bad translation. This is the oldest translation from Whiston. I should have gotten the one from Loeb Classical Library, but I just moved and I couldn't find it in my boxes. This is a really not great translation. But essentially, Josephus is taking away all the back and forth and says, Abraham said, are you sure? I'm going to pray for them. And God says, I'm pretty sure. And then God goes and destroys Sodom. Similarly, with the story of the Akedah in Bereshit Chaf-Bet, Abraham, although in the Torah, Abraham really doesn't respond, Josephus goes even farther and says, yes, Avram kept it a secret from his wife. He didn't tell anyone. He was so committed to no one interrupting or risking his fulfillment of God's command. So Josephus is really, really uncomfortable with the stories of Abraham arguing with God, and similarly with Moshe. In Bereshit, in Shemot, Prakim, Gimel, and Dalid, we know that Moshe goes back and forth with all kinds of arguments that he is not the person to take the people out of Egypt. And here we have this kind of beautiful reverie. It's not an argument at all. In Josephus, we have a rumination on his own limitations in eloquence. So again, this is Josephus's retelling of Shemot Gimel. Moshe, in consternation at that which he had seen, replied, to mistrust, O Lord, thy power, which I venerate myself and know to have manifested to my forefathers, were madness. So in other words, of course I trust, but I'm at a loss to know how I, a mere commoner, blessed with no strength, could find the words to persuade my people to quit that land. So it's not that I don't believe you, God. It's simply that I am so humble that I don't think I'm the right person to take them out. But again, a very, very long 2-chapter dialogue is condensed into just that little rumination. And then we're told by Josephus, Moshe, unable to doubt the promises of the deity, after having seen and heard such confirmation of them, prayed and entreated that he might be vouchsafed this power in Egypt. So again, rather than having a back and forth dialogue, we have teased out either prophecy, God to the hero, or prayer, the hero to God, because that is a way to remove the tension from these very difficult and challenging dialogues. And so here Josephus says, no, there was no back and forth between God and Moshe. There was simply Moshe praying to God that he would be successful in this mission. I want to look briefly at a few other interpreters that were writing during this era, so that you can see the extent to which Jews at this time, these are observant Jews, pious Jews, Jews who are studying their scripture, they were so uncomfortable with these stories. And I want to share with you a beautiful play. This is a play known as Exegog, the Exodus. It was produced in the 2nd century BCE in Greek by an observant Jew living in Hellenistic Egypt. And this is a play that retells the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. It's translated here again in kind of antiquated English, so it's a little bit difficult, but you'll see once more that the writer here turns Moshe's protest to God in Shemot, Prakim, Gimel, and Dalid into a lovely reverie, not an argument, not a protest, not a challenge, but a beautiful reverie. This is cited by the church father Eusebius, and so you'll see parenthetical comments made by Eusebius, but this is a quotation, scholars believe, of the original play. which reads in part as follows. God addresses Moshe, "Stay, Moshe, best of men, do not come near till you have loosed the bindings from your feet." Imagine this in Greek. "The place on which you stand is holy ground, and from this bush God's word shines forth to you. Take courage, son, and listen to my words." Go a little down. "God am I of those your fathers three, of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, I am he." The translator tried to make it rhyme. "Mindful of my promises to them to save my Hebrew people, I have come." And then Eusebius tells us a few speeches farther down, Moshe replies, "I am not by nature eloquent." And again, this is produced to be performed. So imagine Jewish performers in the 2nd century BCE standing on a stage before an audience, uttering these soliloquies, these speeches. So the actor who plays Moshe will say, "I am not by nature eloquent. My tongue with difficulty speaks. I stammer so that I cannot speak before the king." And then in reply to these things, God answers him, "Your brother Aaron I will send with haste, to whom you'll tell all things that I have said." And so we have 2 very extensive chapters of argumentation that is just condensed into this one line of, "But why me? I'm so humble. I'm not eloquent." And God says, "Don't worry about it. That's why we have Aaron." Again, very condensed. We're taking the tension out of the story and smoothing it over so that no one will think that the biblical hero, the great pious Moshe, fights with God. That is not tenable to these interpreters. Similarly, Eusebius cites another Jewish interpreter from the same time, the 2nd century BCE, known as Artapanus, who writes a fascinating retelling of the Torah. We don't have the whole thing. We only have the pieces that Eusebius cites. That Eusebius cites, and Artapanus adds all kinds of details that you will not find anywhere in the Torah. Moshe being the teacher of Orpheus, teaching mankind many useful things, being the inventor of ships. He's trying to impress his Hellenistic audience. But for our purposes, I want to show you what Artapanus says about the moment when Moshe comes to the site of the burning bush. Moshe knows that the Israelites are in trouble, and he knows that they're in crisis. And so he prays to God to put an end to the suffering of the tribes. And then as a response to that, God appears to Moshe in fire. Rather than God appearing in fire and Moshe saying, "What? This doesn't make sense for me. I'm just a shepherd in the wilderness, working for my Midianite priest father-in-law." Moshe, from the very beginning, is deeply loyal to the Israelites and asks God to somehow get involved and says, "Please put an end to this." So Moshe has a character in which he takes the initiative. We know that from the Torah, and Artapanus builds on that and says, well, Moshe was praying to God, and then God responds with fire. Fire, it is said, suddenly blazed up out of the earth and went on burning, though there was no wood, no any other fuel in the place. And Moshe was frightened at the occurrence and took to flight, but a divine voice spake to him to march against Egypt and rescue the Jews. So Artapanus completely skips the argument between Moshe and God. It's not there at all. Now, if you take all of these together, Philo, Josephus, Exegog, and Artapanus, you can get a sense of how, and again, these are pious interpreters. These are not Hellenized Jews. You can get a sense of how biblical interpreters at the turn of the millennium really did not feel comfortable with images of Avram and Moshe challenging God, reasoning, using their kind of the powers of their own logical faculties to prove God wrong. That was simply not acceptable to them. So they smooth these stories over and they minimize them, they elide them, they eclipse them. Now the rabbis take a different approach. We have very little time, so I'm not going to go into this in depth, but I'll show you a couple of examples that I think prove the point. And I want to begin by sharing with you a tradition preserved in the Tanchuma. In the Tanchuma, we read, I'll just do the English. Rabbi Levi said, "Why did the Holy One, blessed be he, reveal his decision about Sodom to Avram? Because Avram had been critical of what God had done in the generation of the flood. And Avram, who had not been consulted, of course, he wasn't necessarily alive, but Avram was critical and had said, there's no way that in the whole world there weren't 20 or 10 righteous men. And so God was wrong. God should not have destroyed nearly the entire world. God should have acted with more mercy. And so in this case, Rabbi Levi says, God was worried about how Avram would react to the destruction of Sodom. And he said, I'm going to engage Avram in conversation. I'm going to initiate a dialogue with Avram to explain to him that there is no one righteous in Sodom and the city cannot be saved and does not deserve to be saved. And so this, I think, is a fascinating reversal of a dynamic that we often think about, where here, rather than the hero reaching out to God, praying to God, searching for God, finding God, we have God wanting Avram's approval and saying, I recognize that Avram is critical of my divine choices, and I don't want that. I want Avraham and I to be on the same page. God desires a closeness. God desires an intimacy. And God engages with Avram, knowing that Avram is going to respond with argument, knowing that that Avram is not going to be satisfied with this divine decision. I need to wrap up, but I'll just say one last thing about a famous tradition in Brachot that interprets Shemot Lamed Bet, I think it's Pasuk Yud Aleph, right after the catastrophic sin of the golden calf, where God is ready to destroy the people. And says essentially to Moshe, leave me alone because I'm just going to consume them and start a new nation from you. We have an interpretation where the rabbis imagine Moshe seizing the garment of God. It's as if Moshe took hold of the Holy One, blessed be he, like a man who seizes his fellow by his garment and said before him, Sovereign of the universe, I will not let you go until you forgive and pardon them. And here, the argumentation of Moshe is nothing less than heroic. There was nothing else Moshe could have done or should have done. Moshe had a moral obligation to respond to God's choice and say, I do not accept the current reality. I do not accept your decision. It is incumbent upon me to intervene on behalf of my people and to insist that something be done to save them. And so this is a far cry from the interpretation of Philo, who says, God forbid you should think that God is changeable. God is never changeable. Here, the rabbis allow for the possibility that, in fact, a great person who confronts God out of love and trust and a desire for intimacy, that person can, in fact, appeal to God and change God's choices. However, we can conceive of that with our limited minds, living in the constrictions of space and time. We have to trust that, in fact, we are capable of changing God, who is transcendent and exists beyond space and time. Nevertheless, we have to trust that, in fact, we are capable of doing that. And so the rabbis understand that the Torah describes God as searching for a relationship, and that these descriptions teach us that God is willing to constrict himself to enter the human realm in order to forge this bond with humanity, and specifically to forge this bond with the covenantal people of Israel and with those who lead the people. Now, while the Tanakh does not offer the same kinds of guidelines, I think, for how we can speak with one another, I do believe that learning how to speak with God and to God, and knowing that the rabbis not only allow, but permit us to challenge our current reality and to enter into a prayerful experience in a way that challenges that reality, I think that can teach us how to learn to speak to one another, both in terms of coming into dialogues with love and respect and trust, but also with firm boundaries and firm conviction in our beliefs. And I hope that this will be a year in which we can do that while recognizing the divine spark in each person. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop my share and take a look at some of the chat questions, unless Jay wants to.
No, go. You have at least 2.5 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So I will put my email in the chat. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Malka, I have a thought.
Please.
Bechor Shor says regarding the words V'chiper admato amo, that God's territory is his people. So I'm thinking that the whole Torah is an inclusion between the Artsacha, which of God talking to Abraham, and the God talking to Bnei Israel in Ha'azinu.
So you're saying the whole Torah can be taken as a discourse between God and the people?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the very format of rabbinic literature honors this dialogical style, right? There isn't, the goal is not simply to get to the bottom line and know what to do. The goal is to preserve the process of discourse.
That's the significance of the word ad tumam. The last words of the Torah are that God's territory is his people, just as the first words to Abraham are Artsacha, your land. No, it's not your land. Your land is Bnei Israel.
Give Malka a chance to look at the chats.
Is there anywhere in our tradition that says that Avram did not believe that Hashem would have him go through with sacrificing Yitzchak? I'm sure that there is, but I can't say offhand. And from the Second Temple sources, I would say not that I know of.
Malka.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
Yes, my point in the chat and in general as an ancient historian is that this is a unique understanding of a mortal speaking with the divine, because in the Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, this was never possible, and
Exactly.
also in the classical Greek and Roman tradition, it wasn't possible. So this is something that is unique in Judaism, and I can see why, some of the rabbis of the Temple period, or even Josephus Flavius, had difficulty with this.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And I think that we find that inherent in the text itself when Abraham, I think the silence that we see in those early stories, those early encounters, is an assumption that he has no right to respond. And in fact, doing so would be dangerous and foolhardy. And then we find out that the God of Abraham is one that wants relationship, even if it means that this God will be challenged. And so, yes, in the ancient Near Eastern context, this is totally radical. Who are you? I don't.
Ken, go on. Ken.
Okay.
iPad 6.
Yeah, right. I want to know your name. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely.
Welcome.
Okay, Dr. Malka, thank you very much. Always
Yeah.
a pleasure.
Yashikar.
Marcha Tova, and we'll take a 5-second break.